Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin in the name of God. Assalamu alaikum and hello, everyone. We are so excited for you to join us all today. As you know, we've been immersed in this research for so long, and we are excited to finally being able to share it with you all. My name is Nadiah Mohajir, and I am founder and executive director of HEART. HEART is a national nonprofit working to promote sexual health literacy and sexual violence prevention in Muslim communities through our 4 programming arms: health education, advocacy, research, and training. I'm so excited to introduce to you my fellow colleagues and researchers, Alia, Azmat, and Yasmeen Khayr.
Hi, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Alia. Azmat. It's great to be here, and I'm so excited for you all to join us this evening. So a little bit about me. I'm wrapping up my PhD at Purdue University in counseling psychology. Just really broadly, my research interests are in gender and mental and sexual health, as well as women's experiences in therapy. And I'm currently a predoctoral intern at Emory CAPS, and I'll be in private practice next year in Georgia. I've been with Heart since 2013, and I've just been hopping around in different roles. And so I'm really excited that I get to contribute in a research way this time around.
And I'm Yasmeen Khayr. I'm the research coordinator at the Center for Urban Research and Learning at Loyola University Chicago. I've been doing research with Heart for the last couple of years now through Curl. And I also did my master's thesis through Heart as well when I was getting my master's in sociology. So yeah, I'm really excited for us to kind of dig into this many years of research that's all kind of been aligned. So yes, excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen and Alia. And you're going to be hearing from both of them shortly. If we can go to the next slide. So given the nature of our work and the issues that we will be exploring in our research, we understand that some of what we will be presenting today can be upsetting, can be triggering, or difficult to process. And so we ask that you do what you need to take care of yourself. This can look like turning off your camera, getting some snacks, keeping your hands busy, or even just leaving to process and grounding yourself. We will also have a Q&A at the end of this session, as well as a list of resources for you to learn more, both to learn more about the issues, as well as to learn more how to care for yourself and things like that. So just a note, if you do need something, my team, Navila and Sahar and Kiran, are also on Zoom today. So if there's a private message that you want to send one of us, we will be also looking at the chat box to take care of all of that. So just do what you need to take care of yourself. Moving on. So as mentioned earlier, our ongoing programming can be summed up in our acronym HEART, which is Health Education, Advocacy, Research, and Training. So real quickly, just to go over what that means, health education is our largest programming arm, and we provide comprehensive, culturally sensitive health, sexual health, and sexual violence information through interactive and in-person and virtual programming. At the advocacy level, what we do is at the individual level, our trained advocates offer information support and additional referrals to move toward healing and justice. And at the institutional level, we also work to reduce the barriers to services and information. And at the structural level, we advocate for systems change to disrupt and rebuild the world that we want to live in. We also do research where we partner with universities such as Curl at Loyola to conduct research that's specific to Muslim communities to be able to develop effective and sustainable programming and contribute to peer-reviewed literature. And finally, we do training. We offer training and technical assistance to mainstream organizations and Muslim institutions to build their capacity to better serve the sexual and reproductive health needs of Muslim communities. And so today, what we're going to be doing is highlighting in the next few series of webinars that we're going to do. We're hoping to do one again in June, about our research and evaluation from a year-long anti-sexual assault advocacy program that we did on 5 campuses and the studies that it inspired afterward. And so today you're gonna, get some context to that evaluation work. You're going to explore where the research and programming needs are to continue around sexual violence and sexual health education. And finally, really thinking about how to support community members and researchers in engaging in critical thought about research and sexual violence programming in Muslim communities. Next slide, please. So again, this is just a visual overview of how we're going to be talking about the work. So Alia is going to begin sharing about our pilot study, which was looking at the awareness, knowledge, and beliefs about sexual violence. Then Yasmeen will move on to discuss about her thesis research, which is focused on gender and sexuality beliefs among Muslim men on college campuses. And then finally, I'm going to briefly mention our current national study that is looking at the burden of sexual violence among Muslims in North America. This will be followed by a discussion and with each other, as well as the community that is attending today. And then in June, the tiny offshoot circle that we have there is the next conversation we're going to have, which is going to look specifically at some of the campus organizing that happened on one of the campuses that we worked with, and what kinds of things took place when we were working to create victim-centric spaces for Muslim survivors on college campuses. So that will be in June, but wanted to just sort of name that is part of this series. Next slide. While there are 3 of us here today with you, we would be remiss not to acknowledge the full research team that is associated with these studies. First and foremost, our partners at Curl at Loyola, Gina Spitz in particular, Monica Reyna, both of them were co-authors on this study, and David Van Zijtveld, who is the director at Curl, as well as Dr. Samina Rahman, Dr. Wajiha Akhtar Khalil, Hadi Sise, and Mona Badawi. All 4 of those folks are also involved in our burden study that is currently happening. So just wanted to extend our gratitude to all of these amazing folks, as well as the great students that we were able to work with on the West Coast and across the country that were participants in this study that we're about to present. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alia, who will begin talking about the first study.
Thanks, Nadiah. So again, as Nadiah mentioned, this first sort of pilot study came out of the year-long sexual violence training and education program that we did across 5 campuses. And so just a little bit about that program. HEART had recruited Muslim students who wanted to engage their campus communities around learning about and supporting survivors of sexual violence. And so the data that we're going to be reviewing together right now, or within this first sort of branch, is the data that came from participants and leaders after the workshop about their attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge around campus resources and around sexual violence terms. So go ahead to the next slide, please. And so just a really brief literature review. So we know that approximately rates of sexual violence on campuses suggest that about 20% of women experience some type of sexual assault during college. And 90% of those are often committed by an acquaintance or someone that they know. We also know that a number of the programming, or at least the literature on the programming, is often around campus-based sexual violence. And it's heavily centered around the experiences of white or Eurocentric bodies and narratives around how and when sexual violence might be occurring on campuses or in that age group. And so we also kind of want to recognize that there are institutional and interpersonal barriers, things like racism and Islamophobia, that might be contributing to not only culturally sensitive programming from the institution, but also how individuals working at the institution are responding and are able to support Muslim survivors. And so we also know, or the literature, suggests that sexuality education often includes implicit and explicit messages around sex and around sexual education that reinforce hierarchies and inequity around race, class, gender identity, particularly in the United States. And what we argue and what we've also seen is that the perpetuation of some of those stereotypes around sex and sexuality continue in Muslim communities. And so some of those examples are, things like Muslim women are sexually passive objects. Muslim women deserve the violence that is enacted upon them by virtue of being Muslim or by virtue of, being committed to a particular faith, and then that Muslim men are inherently violent towards Muslim women. So these are some of the just examples of how, again, implicit and explicit biases in sexual messaging can impact programming as well as support for students on campus. You can go on to the next slide. And so just in terms of our literature review, at the time of this pilot study, there was no specific data on the prevalence, so how frequently sexual violence is occurring within campus communities within the Muslim population on campus. There was no data on attitudes, beliefs, or knowledge about sexual violence for Muslims, both on and off campuses. And so the pilot study really is, or this first study really is only looking at campus environments, and then we're going to kind of broaden out as the talk continues or the webinar continues. So go ahead and move to the next slide. And so given that we're really only looking at college campuses for this particular study, some of the research questions that we were looking to answer and the research questions that we're going to review today are: what are Muslim college students' awareness of the prevalence of sexual violence on campus? What are Muslim college students' familiarity with sexual violence terms? And what are Muslim college students' beliefs related to culturally specific rape myths? And so you can go on to the next slide. And the way that we kind of collected information or the data to answer those questions look like this. So we had, again, the post-workshop data from the Reliance programming. It was a quantitative survey, so there was Likert scale items around questions of prevalence, like including yourself. How many students at your university do you know that have experienced some form of sexual violence? As well as demographic information in that quantitative survey. So things like age, race, gender, year in school, and sexual orientation. And then we had these items that we are calling culturally specific. So some of those examples you can see on the screen, but a woman who's experienced sexual assault is less desirable as a partner. In a majority of sexual assault cases, the victim is promiscuous. A man is somewhat justified in forcing a woman to have sexual intercourse or perform other sexual acts, and men shouldn't be blamed as harshly if they sexually assault a woman who is drunk or high. So these are some of the things that we were trying to capture and trying to kind of see how folks were responding. And in the next slide, we'll see a little bit of who was surveyed and some of our results. And so with our results, what we ended up doing, we collected information from Muslim and non-Muslim participants. But for this particular piece, we really wanted to focus again on Muslim students' attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs. And so our sample size was 91 Muslim identified respondents. In terms of race, about 56%, so 51 individuals identified as South Asian or Asian, of Asian descent. We've got 17% or 16 folks that identified with MENA, 9.9% or 9 individuals identified as Black, and then with NA and multiracial, we had about seven folks each, and Hispanic, there was 1, and I don't know if you can really see that sliver. In terms of gender identity of folks, an overwhelming, number of the folks that attended and responded were women. So we've got 70% there, 28% men, and then one non-binary individual. And then in terms of sexual orientation, a majority of this sample was heterosexual. So we've got about 89% or 81 people who are heterosexual, and then there's a little bit of a spectrum there as well. So that's just a sense of who is responding in this way. And so we can go to the next slide and I'll share kind of what we found. And so with that first question that I had mentioned around including yourself, how many students do you know who have experienced some form of sexual violence? 54%, 54.9% stated that they know at least one or more student. And then an even larger percent stated that they knew one or more students who had experienced some form of sexual harassment. And so in terms of research questions with prevalence, this is our first finding. So but over 50% of the people surveyed knew at least one person. And so we're really starting to get a picture of prevalence and awareness of sexual violence concerns within this population. The one thing here, though, is that we don't know if the individuals that they knew identified as Muslim. So it's possible that these folks were endorsing this item and they knew a survivor that was not Muslim. But at the end of the day, this is also still, again, capturing a picture around what do Muslim students know and who are they engaging with. We can go to the next slide. So this next one is our second research question, which is what are Muslim college students' familiarity with sexual violence terms? And so this table here, we used a number of different analyses to assess, between, as you can see up here, gender, men and women, non-binary, and total. And so we have the different terms that we asked them. So sexual violence terms such as rape culture, victim blaming, sexual assault, male privilege, and consent. And my little arrows here are demonstrating where folks were. And so with a total amount of about 70% were very familiar with the term rape culture, 86% were very familiar with victim blaming, 81 sexual assault, 86 male privilege, and 85 with consent. But then the circled items that we have here, so the ones with the stars and the ones that are circled, were statistically significant in terms of differences between men and women. And so what I want you to kind of pay attention to here is the difference between men and women who knew or had familiarity with these terms, particularly around male privilege. So that's maybe our largest stat here with 0.0, and we've got 96% of women knowing or being familiar with that item or that term, and considerably less men being familiar with that term. You can go to the next slide. So our third and final question with this first study was what are Muslim college students' beliefs related to culturally specific rape myths? And those are the items that I read out to you earlier when we were reviewing methods. And so again, with these items, we have this Likert scale of strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, somewhat disagree, strongly agree, and NA. And so the arrows here again are what I'm wanting to kind of highlight is first, of course, the total number of folks and the spectrum here around strongly disagree, strong disagree with these items. But then also these items again are statistically significant by gender. And so we've got women endorsing, more women endorsing this strongly disagree for a woman who has experienced sexual assault is less desirable than we do men. And the same for this item, in a majority of sexual assault cases, the victim is promiscuous. And so it looks as though the men were split a little bit here between disagree and strongly disagree in a way that the women were not. And so that's a really important finding with these culturally specific rape myths. And we're going to show you some more information on the second two in the next slide. And so here we continue to see, the circles and the stars in terms of these items being statistically significant in terms of differences between men and women, or Muslim men and women, where we've got women at strongly disagree for the item a man is somewhat justified in forcing a woman to have sexual intercourse, and men again being a little bit more split between the disagree and the strongly disagree, and the same for this last item. So men shouldn't be blamed as harshly. Yes, they are. I see a comment in the chat. These are so sad. So take a minute to process kind of what this is meaning in terms of the endorsements and the differences between gender, because if you can go on to the next slide, we are, we're really thinking about how this shows up on campus, both in terms of programming and in terms of education moving forward, right? So some of the implications that we kind of came to at the end of this first study is, one, that Muslim students know folks who are impacted by sexual violence. So over 50% of the students surveyed know someone who's experienced sexual violence. And that really, to us, communicates that there's a need to support Muslim students as they support survivors of violence. And that we do need more data on the prevalence of Muslim survivors. And so again, with that caveat that we didn't ask, or the question was worded in a way that it was unclear around if it was them or if it was a different individual, and if that individual was Muslim. And so really refining our questions and our methods to get a sense of what is the prevalence of Muslim survivors, period. The next implication that we have here is just that knowledge about resources and terms related to sexual violence differ by gender. And so in that first slide that we showed around, male privilege, consent, and the statistically significant circled items, there's research to suggest that, women may have more familiarity because of their own experiences. Women perhaps have more familiarity because women often disclose stories to other female friends. But just an important finding here is that women in this study in particular had more knowledge and familiarity with terms and resources. And then finally, our final implication here is that rape culture attitudes and belief vary significantly between Muslim men and Muslim women. So those are the slides that we kind of went over in terms of the disagree and the strongly disagree, and some of the items and beliefs varying by gender. And so what that's led us to believe, or led us to think about more intentionally, is what gender-specific programming would be necessary to help Muslim men address some of these beliefs and some of these attitudes. And we also kind of want to note that in the literature around rape myths on college campuses, this is, congruent with the literature in non-Muslim men. And there's this like added level of, what about the culturally specific elements can we do to address that? But we don't want you all coming away from this to say that Muslim men are inherently, more problematic perhaps than non-Muslim men. It's more that the results that we found are fitting with some of the larger patterns that we see on college campuses. And so Yasmeen's actually going to talk more about that, because her study then kind of takes these implications and goes even deeper around how we can contribute to this work. So I'll pass it off to her now. Thanks.
Thanks, Alia. Yeah, so kind of going off of that, those stark differences around gender on those, beliefs around sexual assault, we wanted to dig into, why are Muslim men having such different perceptions around sexual assault? And so my study kind of started looking at, what's the intersection of gender and religion, and how Muslim men are socialized to think about power and sexual assault. And so we want to do this in a way that kind of tries to get at root causes of those beliefs and behaviors, rather than trying to isolate these issues to a single person or community, as Alia was saying. But at the same time, we also do want to understand the specific social location of Muslim men and the stigma around sex and sexual assault within Muslim communities and how that plays into their held beliefs around sexual assault. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So my study focused on two major research questions. So what attitudes do Muslim men on college campuses hold regarding sexual assault? And then a little deeper, how does the religiosity and adherence to masculine role norms impact those attitudes? So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the theoretical foundations for this. I will try to keep this concise because there's a lot going on, but feel free to ask questions afterwards. So it's really important, as Alia mentioned, to understand how rape myths work and how those play a role in, how Muslim men are trying to understand sexual assault and sexual violence more broadly. So rape myths are generalized cultural beliefs that perpetuate aggressive behaviors and victim blaming, particularly against survivors, to undermine the gravity of sexual assault. So many studies have associated rape myths with sex and gender role stereotyping that are deeply rooted in patriarchal notions of masculinity. And so there has been less research regarding the role of religion on these beliefs. But for Muslims impacted by sexual assault, we have to look at, how our faith is being taught around these things across our different communities. And so while, Islam as a faith tradition frames sex and sexuality as, forms of worship and service to God, like the patriarchal interpretations of sex and these other topics have been dominated by men in a way that have, historically institutionalized sex as impure and as an act that must be suppressed. So a lot of these interpretations operate as religious justifications for shame, and they reinforce this gender hierarchy where men, are morally regulating the purity and sexuality of women, particularly as a form of power and control. And so we're placing these sexual assault beliefs and the role that faith-based approaches to sex and sexual violence within a larger context of hegemonic masculinity. And that's, kind of a academic term, but, it's an interactional systemic form of masculinity where, it perpetuates and naturalizes this gender hierarchy within a social structure and through social action. And it's upheld by everyone, men, women, whoever. But it's fostering this, sexual aggression and hostility towards women particularly. And so these patriarchal interpretations are just one example where Muslim men can perpetuate that dominance over women and use it as a form of power and control. So I tried to kind of visualize that a little bit here, but the process is not linear. There's a lot of overlap that's going on and kind of figuring out where, there's different forms of power and control that are overlapping here, but they can manifest through religion, cultural norms, gender identity, and I'll start kind of digging into that a little bit now. So can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So through this framework, I ended up using a quantitative survey to understand kind of a breadth of information surrounding Muslim men and their beliefs around sexual assault, masculinity, and religion. So I was able to have 47 participants fully complete the survey, all Muslim men, and mostly through recruiting through different MSAs and other cultural groups on college campuses in the Chicagoland area. The survey itself included demographic questions along with 3 pre-tested measures. So that includes masculine role norms inventory revised, which are the very very straightforward masculine statements around masculine gender roles. And then the psychological measure of Islamic religiousness, which was a variety of measures around religiosity for Muslims particularly. And then the rape attitudes and belief skill, which was the overall sexual assault beliefs those were statements as well. And then I also adapted some questions based on a resource actually had come out focused on myths surrounding sexual assault in Muslim communities. So that included, there was some overlap with some of those sexual assault beliefs and myths that was used in that pilot study. So if you can go to the next slide. So what you see here are the overall means for each measure that was included in the survey. So for both the sexual assault attitudes and the masculine role norms, questions were rated from 1 to 5, with five being strongly, 1 being strongly agree and 5 being strongly disagree. So we see from the sexual assault attitudes that there's a general disagreement, since the numbers are closer to 5. And those statements are centered around victim blaming statements, tactics used to do harm, justifications that excuse sexual assault, and the sexual assault myths specific to Muslim communities. Whereas for the masculine role norms, those ones were centered on sexuality, dominance, and statements around aggression. And we see a lot more variability here and less disagreement than with the sexual assault myths. And then finally, the religiosity questions, those ones were a little varied in how they were measured, but those focused on religious beliefs, religious duty, and global religiousness. These questions had, they didn't end up showing too much. It actually showed that they were helpful to kind of see the homogeneity of the participants we had in terms of having pretty high levels of religiosity. So they won't super come into play, but I just wanted to kind of show that there. You can go to the next slide. And so with all this in mind, I want to kind of dig deeper into the sexual assault attitudes particularly, and those are meant to answer the main research question, which is what attitudes do Muslim men on college campuses hold regarding sexual assault? So overall, that composite mean was 4.36 out of 5 across the measures. So that revealed that respondents had a propensity to disagree with sexual assault attitudes. So for instance, statements around justifications and tactics revealed a pretty strong tendency for participants to disagree, whereas statements around victim blaming and the sexual assault myths particular to Muslim communities showed a lot more variability. So the data I've included here are all the Muslim, or they're not all of them, but they're all Muslim-centered myths around sexual assault. And I wanted to kind of just reveal some of the more nuanced findings that kind of align with some of the other research we conducted. So for example, if a woman wears hijab and dresses modestly, she will be protected from sexual assault. Only 51.1% strongly disagreed, and there was quite a bit of variability across the other options as well, including 8.5 who strongly agreed and 14.9 who slightly agreed. Another one, it was if a woman only interacts with other females and close male relatives, she can prevent being sexually assaulted. Again, this is 44.7% strongly disagreed, which is pretty low when you compare it to some of the other statements I had shared with folks. And then finally, if someone discloses that she has been sexually abused or sexually assaulted, no one will marry her because she is not a virgin. Again, 44.7% disagreed with this, but with 19.1 who slightly agreed, as well as some other variability across the other options. But there's a lot going on here, so I'm just gonna have folks kind of look at those a little bit. But if you can go to the next slide. So based on this variability on the victim blaming and the myths within the Muslim communities, those statements, we can infer that some Muslim men may instrumentalize blame and justifications through cultural, religious behaviors, as well as fear as a means to undermine the experience of victims. And undermine the constructive ways of dismantling these deeper causes of sexual assault. And on the other hand, the overall disagreement with the tactics and more overt justifications for sexual assault revealed that Muslim men may recognize the harm in these behaviors that, that force sex upon women, but may not completely understand the covert ways of perpetuating these beliefs that may justify sexual assault. If you can go to the next slide. So then here, I wanted to kind of pull out the tests that are focused on masculinity and the role of masculinity on the sexual assault attitudes. So I ran some tests kind of comparing the masculine role norms and the sexual assault beliefs. And many of these revealed pretty strong and statistically significant relationships. So for example, if a woman wears hijab and dresses modestly, she will be protected from sexual assault. When that was crossed with, the statement of masculine dominance, a man should provide the discipline in the family, it revealed a strong positive relationship, revealing that masculine role norms are much more likely to have a relationship with the sexual assault beliefs and how the men would, conceptualize about certain sexual assault beliefs. So I've included a couple other associations here between the sexual assault beliefs and various masculine norms. And the numbers here are gamma coefficients, but they showed pretty, moderate to strong relationships. I also conducted some associations between sexual assault beliefs and the religiosity measures, but there was almost no association there, showing that the masculine role norms are really playing a huge part in how Muslim men understand sexual assault. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to kind of bring this all home, I tested the intersection of all three of these factors. So masculinity, religiosity, and sexual assault. I used an ordinal logistic regression to assess, whether masculinity and religiosity could together help us understand sexual assault a little bit better. So together they're able to kind of explain 31% of variance of sexual assault beliefs. So kind of trying to understand, like, when there's that variability in how folks are understanding sexual assault, how much of that is reliant on how they understand masculinity and the religiosity. However, it was really masculinity that was really pulling through in terms of what was the main reason for these associations. So again, what does this all mean? In terms of the masculinity and the variability across these statements, participants were likely to, believe traditional gender roles and the perpetuation of sexual assault beliefs. So we can't say to what extent the Muslim men perpetuate these negative norms, but we can acknowledge that there is a deeper manifestation of masculinity that we are trying to understand and how they might perceive and perpetuate negative sexual assault attitudes. In terms of the religiosity, I know I didn't focus on those too much, but it showed that, a lot of the respondents, abided by Islamic tenets, but it didn't really help us understand anything about how their religious identity may impact how they understand sexual assault. So I don't want to undermine the role of religion, but I think it signals to us another reason to look at religious identity and experiences a little bit more in a more nuanced way, and how they may uncover other ways that sexual assault attitudes are formed. So again, the study really confirmed that men, regardless of their religious identity, are likely to perpetuate these negative perceptions of sexual assault. And again, as kind of in line with what Alia was sharing, this contributes to the existing literature around, how men are impacting, sexual assault and how that and the beliefs around them. But it's also giving us an opportunity to kind of delve into more of the cultural norms that perpetuate masculine dominance and sexual violence within Muslim communities. To the next slide, please. And so, when we're thinking of implications for this study particularly, I do want to elevate the presence of Muslim men within the larger conversation around sexual assault and its perpetuation, if we are to confront gender-based violence internally within Muslim communities, as well as in more mainstream movements. In terms of the research methods, the surveys in school, the scales I used were all validated, but none of them were created particularly for Muslims. So it's really hard to determine, to what extent these measures can really capture Muslim men's perception of sexual assault. And also the sample was pretty homogeneous in terms of the high religiosity and a little unrepresentative in terms of race and ethnic composition compared to the larger Muslim American population. And so again, this is similar to what Alia was sharing, but it's an encouragement for Muslim researchers to create more nuanced and culturally tailored measurements that fully capture religious and cultural identity and experiences. And then, of course, one of the largest barriers is the stigmatized topic of sexual assault and the barriers within our Muslim communities of engaging this larger social issue. And so the research Khayr has been doing is not only meant to have more Muslim representation in the research, but to do a bit more of that culture shifting work through these culturally specific programming and education to kind of unhinge these deeply ingrained sexual assault attitudes in our communities. And with that, I will pass it on to Nadiah.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen and Alia, both for just really just your brilliant reflections on what these research studies can sort of imply for future research that we can do, as well as for future, how to inform our future programming, both HEARTS programming as well as the movements programming when it comes to designing programs that are reaching hard to reach communities like Muslim communities. So I wanted to just do a really quick overview of our current study that we're doing right now to encourage folks to spread the word, continue to spread the word, and also just sort of share with you some of our initial findings. Not going to spend too much time on this because I really want to open it up for discussion. But if you go to the next slide, what we're doing right now is, and I put the link in the chat box as well. There's two studies that Alia and Yasmeen just talked about actually informed a larger study that we're working on that we launched last year in April of 2020. And so what we wanted to do was a national study. So, as you know, Alia's study that she talked about was a small pilot study on college campuses. Yasmeen's focused specifically on Muslim men on college campuses. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to say, what would it look like for us to launch a larger study on a national scale for both men and women and see what's happening there. And so what we are looking at, the research questions that we're looking at is, what is the burden of sexual violence, sexual dysfunction, and spiritual abuse in North America among Muslims 18 to 45? What is the rate of disclosure and or seeking help for these experiences? And what are the barriers to seeking help and information? And you'll see some of the criteria. You have to currently identify as Muslim, live in either the United States or Canada, and be between the ages of 18 and 45. So moving on to the next slide, what resulted is actually a very long survey. It's a 151 question IRB approved survey that is using several evidence-based instruments, including the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And we're looking at the following indicators. Again, we're looking at, of course, demographics. We're looking at prevalence. So really naming specific experiences and saying, has this happened to you? How many times has it happened to you? By whom has it happened to you? Looking at knowledge of sexual violence issues and terms. Again, we're looking at attitudes and beliefs again, and we're looking at barriers to help. Wanted to name some of the specific cultural specific attitudes and beliefs that we're looking at using a Likert scale. So if you do not date or have a partner, you will be protected from sexual abuse and rape. if you wear hijab and dress modestly, you will be protected from sexual abuse and rape. So you can see that there's a lot of overlap because we wanted to see if these themes sort of were consistent when the study got larger. Currently, we have over 800 respondents, and we're hoping to spread the word a little bit more to see if our sample size can increase a little bit, but also really excited about having 800 respondents already. And the initial data is actually indicating that the gendered themes in particular that we found in the first 2 surveys are still consistent. So in other words, we are continuing to see statistically significant differences among men and women when specifically looking at these attitudes and beliefs. And as I mentioned, some of these attitudes are included on the slide. We have actually a number more that we did not include on the slide, but these are the few that we wanted to share with you today. And so, yeah, that is the overview that I wanted to provide of this study. We're hoping to start analysis this summer and perhaps, go really deep into analysis and start writing papers and producing all the things for everyone early next year, God willing, inshallah. So at this time, we'd like to just open it up for discussion and community engagement with each other and with all of you who attended the webinar to just see what kinds of concerns or questions or curiosities are coming up after learning about some of this research. So I'm going to feel free to use a chat box. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. We're also happy to, the 3 of us, we're also happy to continue talking even more about some of the things that we're thinking about, but really want to hear from you all who took the time out today to attend. What made you choose quantitative research methods? Who wants to go?
I can go if you want. I think for both well, I guess all of them are using quantitative measures, but because like there is almost no literature out there, like really having a wide breadth of information around Muslims focused on sexual assault, quantitative measures are a really good way to assess, a large amount of information. So it also is, really helpful to get that like exploratory overview of what's happening in an easy and pretty quick way. Obviously, qualitative is great for going a little bit deeper and kind of understanding the depth of why things are happening or how things are happening, or why folks perceive sexual assault in the ways that they do. But starting with the quantitative is really helpful to kind of start that conversation and giving us a good foundation for just kind of getting a sense of what is happening in our communities. I mean, I'm hoping that once the burden study and we get which is a huge study at this point, like 800 is huge. It's a huge sample, particularly for Muslim respondents. That'll give us a lot of more information of what is happening on a wider scale. And hopefully we can start doing a little bit more qualitative work after that to kind of, okay, now we know generally what's happening, but how can we kind of get deeper into these pretty nuanced, issues that are happening.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, totally agree with you, Yasmeen. I think, quantitative research just allows you to get a really big picture of what the landscape is. And the pilot study that Alia reported on actually does have a qualitative component to it that is the focus of our next webinar in June. We have a whole report that we're going to release with that as well. But that was where our student leaders on campus were actually interviewed, pre and post, and then also at 6 months to see how our programming impacted them and what was the landscape of, happening on college campuses. So please join us again next month to learn more about that research. Again, with qualitative research, the limitation to that is often that the sample size is smaller, much smaller. And so, it has its pros and cons, but the conversation that results from qualitative research can be super rich and insightful. So we definitely want to make sure that we kind of use both approaches to our research. So there's another question: how can organizations, community, and academia work together to produce knowledge? What's the benefit of this? How did this happen? How often does this happen? Yasmeen, I think this might be great for you to share a little bit about like Curl's methodology.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, so with Curl and Hart, I mean, we've been doing work together. I mean, predates me and Curl, but ever since Hart was founded, 10 years of working together and kind of slowly building that relationship between a small organization and a university research center. I will say I don't know how often it happens. Sometimes with Curl, we kind of feel like a little bit unique in how we can try and bridge that gap between a university setting and organizations and larger communities. But it's always so fruitful to see taking something that is so academic and so often siloed in academia, and taking the approaches that we learn through the academic space, and having that be one of the tools in which we can engage nonprofits and other organizations and communities. So using that pilot study, like the survey is not like huge, it's not long or anything. It's we knew Hart was having this workshop and they just wanted to evaluate what was happening. Can we get some data out of this? And so using research as like a one of those steps and saying, okay, what's happening? What is the community sharing with us? What are the tools within the organization and with the university setting? What are ways that we can uplift what's happening in the larger community and use those as tools and not just the end of just having that research and having it sit around. So trying to see where those relationships can be fostered, and using the different skills that and expertise that are coming from both university spaces, organization spaces, and the larger community that hopefully should be the goal for both of these institutions. I think is really a huge part of how we were able to do this research and see it not prove, but like really highlight things that we were seeing in our communities and hearing anecdotally, but having now data to support that and being able to share it in a more streamlined way. Okay, now we can kind of go forward and be like, okay, we have this information, we can share it more broadly now, and have these kind of engagements and share information that's often been denied in our communities. So I don't know if that answers the question, and if there's more follow up from that.
I mean, not to put Alia on the spot, but just wondering, Alia, if you have anything to add from your experiences being in academia as well.
Yeah, I'd say that it is happening often. So I actually just wrote up something that I'm going to send in the chat. But sometimes this type of research where community is informing research questions or research is being informed by community work does take a lot longer, which in the academic system can sometimes be not as helpful if you're looking to, publish papers pretty quickly, right? And so that's also where quantitative work is useful, but or qualitative work is really, rich, but also can sometimes take over 2 years. And so there is a division in APA that I'm familiar with that folks that are interested in some of this work should check out, or I would recommend checking out, which is the Society for Community Research and Action. And I'd say the way that it works is the way that, Heart and Curl, and I guess me as a part of Heart, are coming together in this moment, right? So the prevalence study or the burden study really does seem to be coming from this community need to understand, what are the numbers, what are the facts? And then there's also this gap in the literature that we're trying to fill. And so I think what it requires is that academics or researchers in the spaces that they're in build relationships with organizations and with communities, or really lean into doing research that can sometimes feel a little messier or feel like it's not happening as quickly, but is really supporting the needs of the folks on the ground. So I think it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of training that maybe not everyone is equipped to do, but you do it anyway.
Thank you. And I would just add to that, the other reason that I've noticed is, first of all, I love the ways that Curl approaches research, in the sense that it doesn't live in the ivory tower, and they want to sort of partner with community-based organizations and let the communities lead, what they think is best for their communities in terms of how to design the project and all of that. And then help, make sense of it. So I love that. And I just want to name that, like, oftentimes another reason that research can take longer is because of funding, right? Like, I think, oftentimes community-based organizations continue to be under capacity, under resource, et cetera. And so, and it's really hard to get grants that are for this kind of research. Like, if you live in academia, you might be able to land, the really fancy NIH grant or CDC grant or whatever. But, if you don't have that academic connection, then oftentimes, it's really hard to justify to foundations and funders to be able to get that the funding for that kind of research as well. So just want to name that that's another reason why that kind of work can take longer. Even this pilot study, the program, and both the quantitative and qualitative data, we collected that back in 2018, I believe. And now we are getting to the dissemination part, right? So it takes a while to get there. So we have another, is it more difficult to get research on Muslim women that isn't supporting the war on terror and Islamophobia funded, published, supported? Is it more difficult to get research that isn't supporting the war on terror and Islamophobia? Right. Okay. I get that question. I think that's a really important question, and definitely something that we talk about, not just getting research on, Muslims, but also just programming for Muslims. I think oftentimes language matters, and the ways in which funders and policymakers think about the intersection of being Muslim and violence, and state violence and domestic violence and sexual violence. Thinking about the language that we use to describe violence against women. So for example, if I was to write a grant that named honor killings and female genital mutilation and acid attacks, compared to writing the same application, but saying intimate partner violence or domestic violence or sexual violence, it's going to be seen differently. And a lot of the times it's because these terms like honor killings and FGM, like while I do not absolutely want to minimize the fact that these experiences happen, they do happen all the time, but it's also a way in which the Western movement has sort of exotified Muslims and otherized Muslims to, that's the kind of violence that happens back home, et cetera. And so it's really important to think about even the language that you're using in your grant apps, whether you're talking about research or whether you're talking about programming, and whether or not it is reinforcing some of those Islamophobic tropes.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, like, when I was doing my thesis as well, like, I wanted to make sure that that we weren't starting off with this assumption that Muslim men are inherently violent, that they're, and, encourage those gendered Islamophobic tropes around the violence of men and the oppression of women, Muslim women. But, going a bit broader and saying, okay, how do they fit with the general population? Like, this is not just a Muslim man issue. This is happening globally. This is a wider issue that's happening in this gendered system. So being really upfront and being clear in the language that we're using, that's going to be, kind of at the forefront of the work that we're doing.
Any other questions or reflections from the audience? I mean, we came up with some questions if people are comfortable sharing, but really thinking about some of the findings that we shared today. What do you find most compelling, and what do you find most challenging to reckon with?
Yeah, I'd really like to hear from audience members, if possible, just about how you're making sense of some of the data that we found. And if not, I'll answer also, but wanting to hear from folks that are less familiar, I guess, with the data.
Okay, there's some stuff in the chat. One of the questions I had was regarding the sampling institutions, if they were four-year residential colleges, universities versus commuter campuses. If they were residential, do you have qualitative leaning as to whether the type of heterogeneity of religiosities interpretations played a role in? Okay. Duly, if you believe the environment of a four-year residential school played a role in how many men replied. Lastly, would you ask in the future if men knew someone who has committed sexual violence? That's a really great question. So in terms of the four-year college question, yes, the one in the pilot study, we had 5 campuses participate. All 5 of them were major universities. In the paper that we wrote, we did not reveal the names of those universities just because that was part of the IRB agreement that we would keep them anonymous. But we had a couple on the West Coast, a few on the Midwest, and then one on the East Coast. So, and they were all four-year colleges.
And the same with my study as well. Those were all four-year colleges or universities. And I think that, I think it definitely plays a role in the type of sample that we're getting. As I kind of briefly mentioned, I think this is similar for the other studies as well, but we're targeting MSAs and these other cultural groups on campuses that in general often are are spaces where, you know, people who tend to be more religious or identify as more religious tend to, you know, they tend to flock to those kind of spaces. So it's hard to, you know, those are the easiest places to recruit, but at the same time, yeah, there's going to be, you know, this, it's going to be pretty homogenous in the kind of things that they believe, and the thing, and the kind of, maybe even the kind of Islam that they're kind of subscribing to, which is another reason why the burden study is so important, because we want to kind of try and get out of that, you know, the MSA college campus environment, to see, like, are these things, first, are these results consistent even out, you know, outside of a small, you know, a pretty narrow space like universities, and then, you know, hoping to get a bit more, you know, diversity and more representative of the larger Muslim communities across North America.
I have a private message here that I think could be really interesting for Alia, who is deeply immersed in academia, but also Yasmeen, since you kind of work at that intersection as well. How do you all take care of yourself as Muslim women when academia can be so violent to not white, wealthy cis men?
Great question. I also want to just tag on before I respond to that, to the question that Jason posed around commuter versus residential universities. I think that that's a really interesting, and I appreciate that question, because it's really making me think about socialization on college campuses and how that might look different for folks who are commuting, and also making me wonder about, you know, how many of the campuses that we did participate or did partner with, how many folks were commuters at that at those campuses. So thanks for that question. It's just making me think deeper, you know, about socialization on college campuses, and it's also making me think about class and what we can ask men in the future. So thanks for that. How do I take care of myself? So I'll just give you a really raw answer, which is, you know, it was a huge learning curve. I study counseling psychology, so I think that for me, there's a lean towards the people that I went to school with and the people that I study with and are in community with. We all lean towards like wanting to be helpers and caregivers. And for me, that meant that I had pretty poor personal boundaries and professional boundaries when I first started my program. That's still, you know, an area of growth edge, I guess, for me. But what I have done, or what I did throughout my program, was I stayed connected to Heart, and I stayed connected to the MSA at Purdue. And what that really did for me was that supplemented some of the confusion that I was feeling in terms of my own, you know, process and identity in academia. And it offered a community outlet where I was able to use some of my skills. It offered a community that I wanted to stay connected to and that I didn't really have in my program. And then it also offered, you know, the remembrance of why I wanted to stay committed to the work and why I needed to graduate. So I don't know if that's real helpful, because at the end of the day, that means I was working twice as much because I was working for Heart and I was doing my program. But I think it was really important for me to stay connected to folks that I felt aligned with the type of work that I wanted to do after I graduated, because that was, you know, really necessary for me to stay committed and stay inspired by the work. Yasmeen, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's so easy to get frustrated, especially at, you know, predominantly white institutions, where you're not likely to find other Muslim researchers, and definitely not Muslim researchers who are doing work on sexual violence and gender-based violence. But then also having to also figure out and navigate the assumptions that are being thrown at you from the folks that you're, faculty members and other folks at these institutions. And I know for myself, I also had to like be wary of those in doing this work, and not internalizing the assumptions around our communities. And this is not, again, it's probably similar to Alia, is not a really easy solution, but again, it was like seeing the work that Heart was doing and the type of leadership, including Nadiah, like seeing the kind of work and like the importance of this work and how hard it is to do it. It was a larger responsibility then. Like, this is more, if we're going to be value driven by compassion and justice and using research to try and get there a little bit, like that has to be the grounding point for the work that we're doing. I know I had hesitancies, like, what does it mean if I'm doing this work? What are other people going to say? What are other Muslims going to say? And like, I just had to just shut them down a little. It was not easy, but like, I literally had to just say to myself, like, people are suffering silently. Our communities, like, we love ignoring these deeper issues and kind of falling, playing the victim card sometimes too much, and not trying to understand, these systemic issues that are affecting us too. So really trying to constantly ground ourselves and, okay, what are the goals that we're trying to achieve? What are the larger things that we want for our communities and the betterment of our communities? And, trying to kind of use that as our compass. It's not an easy one, because we know that there's a lot of hate out there that Heart often gets. But, that shouldn't stop us from trying to, share these findings, share, the anecdotes, share what's happening, what is actually happening in our communities.
Thank you both. I know we're closing in on the end of our time, and I think that this comment by Sadia is a really important one, one that Alia, Yasmeen, and I have discussed before, and also kind of related to a question that I had written for us in discussion. So just wanting to read the comment out loud, reflecting on this session, I think it would be interesting to see how many men view the Prophet, peace be upon him, model of masculinity, since it seems societal understandings and expectations of masculinity play a role in men's attitude regarding sexual violence. And one of the questions that I had that's, sort of, I think, related to that is, what implications, Yasmeen and Alia, do you think that these gender differences in attitudes can have on the future of our communities, particularly Muslim communities?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to go earlier? Do you want to go?
Yeah, you go. I'm marinating.
Okay.
I'm reflecting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one, I think what we, with Heart, and like what I find really admirable in the kind of work that we're doing, and helpful for myself as well, is like always trying to get back to, our Islamic foundations, and that is always going to be, the where we start with a lot of this work. And when I see these results that came up from my study and from the other studies we've been doing, like, how in the world are these beliefs around masculinity and sexual assault, like, in any capacity related to what it means to be Muslim and what it means to follow the Islamic faith. And so to start from that point and, you know, have that shared with folks, and being able to like name that, you know, how do these align with our Islamic beliefs, and the core tenets of what we say we believe, and how do we kind of go back and get to our, you know, what does it mean to be, what does it mean to be a man, a Muslim man? What does it mean to be a Muslim woman? What does it mean to, you know, follow these divine, you know, divine masculinity, divine femininity? What does that mean from the foundation of Islam? And then kind of using that to kind of say, like, how do these align with what's actually happening in our communities? And what is it, how in the world does, you know, the perpetuation of sexual assault align with that in any way? And, you know, I would love to have more direct conversations with Muslim men particularly, and ask, like, you know, how do you see yourself as a Muslim man and your masculinity, and how that plays into your Islam, and how that plays into how you view the Prophet, and, you know, the teachings of the faith. But then also sharing, like, this is also how y'all view it. And, you know, there's a lot of disconnect there. So I don't know if that really answers your questions or any of the questions, but that's kind of what's coming to mind.
Thanks, Yasmeen.
I think for me, you know, what implications do these differences in attitudes have, or like what can they have for the future of our communities? I am really thinking about, Sadia, your question, in that, you know, how did we get here, right? Because we, in preparing this, it was really hard. It was hard to see an item like a man is somewhat justified in forcing a woman to have sexual intercourse be, you know, endorsed, period, right? So it's just difficult. And so I think there's a part of me that wants to say that the implication really is, how did we get here, and what needs to change, and is the community ready to have difficult conversations around culture change? And is the community, like, how are we learning about masculinity? Like Yasmeen said, how is that being talked about in family? How is that being talked about in, you know, friend groups? How is that being talked about in the mosque? So taking maybe more of an ecological approach around, how did we get here that these items are even being endorsed in the way that they are? And then how did we get here that these gender differences are, you know, statistically significant in the way that they are? And so that, I think, takes a lot more work, and will require a lot more community and, you know, hopefully you all engagement, right? Not just engagement in terms of, you know, sharing some of these findings or sharing the burden study, but also really investigating internally within yourselves and within your family units, how is this type of culture potentially being perpetuated? And in what ways is religion endorsing some of these culturally sanctioned rape myths? Because that's also a reality that I've come across in some of the spaces that I've been in religious spaces, that, you know, well, the angels will curse you if you XYZ. And so I think that also makes me want to just invite you all to think more broadly about how we learn about Islam, and how we learn and who we believe is credible in terms of Islamic leadership, in terms of Islamic scholarship, and who we prioritize in terms of care and well-being in our understandings of masculinity and femininity, including, you know, how race impacts that. And there's a comment, I feel like it points to a lack of empathy and rahma. Yes, I agree. And so those are my thoughts. I think the question is actually making me think of more questions to answer, which Nadiah and I have this joke of like, you're just going to keep doing research for us, Alia. And I think that this is also, you know, really speaking to that. So thanks, Nadiah, for helping us think deeply about what that could mean for research and for our work.
Thank you, Alia and Yasmeen. Nabila, if you can just go to the next slide real quick. To Alia's point about, you know, how do we get here and how do we learn Islam and who are we learning Islam from? I think it's really, you know, to her point, it's really important to think about right now the ways in which our communities are structured and our institutions are structured and our mosques are structured. They are predominantly led by, you know, cishet Muslim men. And, I know this is going to sound really cliched, but representation matters. And if we don't have women and non-binary folks and, other marginalized identities sort of being able to lead these conversations and being able to share their perspectives and also uplift the really fabulous female scholarship that's happening that is really challenging some of these patriarchal interpretations of the faith and instead replacing them with more gender equitable interpretations. I think it's really important that's how we can move towards a culture shift. And that work is going to be slow and it's going to take a long time. But I think, the answer to how did we get here has a lot to do with how our communities are structured and who gets to have power. And that is an excellent segue to the slide that I forgot to include. I designed it in Canva and then forgot to include that next month on June 23rd, we will actually be looking at this in more detail, seeing how power and privilege and social capital sort of play out in Muslim communities. And specifically, given our research on college campuses, we're going to be looking specifically among Muslim students on college campuses and how power and privilege can be both an opportunity and a barrier to student activism, around sexual violence advocacy work. And that will be, focused on a lot of our qualitative work. So please join us on June 23rd. We will be advertising that as well on our social media. And definitely contact us if you have any questions. That's the last slide, Nabila. Thank you so much for joining us today. Send us an email, follow us on social media. And if you have any other additional questions, we would be happy to address them. Thank you very much. And once again, I want to show my gratitude to Alia and Yasmeen for joining us today and bringing their brilliance into the webinar.
Thank you. It's great.
Thank you, Nadiah. Yes, for giving us a platform to do this work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I am going to stop the recording.